This presentation is Australia did not exist before the 26th of January 1788. The historical detail for what might appear as an absurd claim is in Chapter 1, Foundations of a New Nation, in my book Prison Halt to Redemption. The key issue is the concept of nation. In my book here, Prison Halt to Redemption. Chapter 1, Foundations of a New Nation. On 28 April 1770, Lieutenant James Cook steered his ship, the Endeavour, into a broad open bay and dropped anchor at its southern shore. He named it Stingray Bay because of the abundance of stingrays in its waters, on which his crew gorged. He later crossed our Stingray Bay in the ship's logs and entered Botany Bay, in tribute to botanist Joseph Banks, the ship's eager scientist. Banks had put together an impressive collection of specimens of unknown plants and animals after trekking around the land bordering the bay's shores. Cook and the Endeavour were on their way back to England after carrying out the official task of observing the transit of Venus from the island of Tahiti. There were also unofficial tasks, one of which was to investigate the existence of the South Land, whose ancient mythology promised great riches. From Roman times it had been called Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown South Land. The search for the mysterious land of the South had occupied the Portuguese, the Dutch, the Spanish and later Englishman William Dampier in 1688 and 1689. Dampier added little to the findings of the Dutch seamen. Until Cook's voyage, the most successful effort to map whatever was south of present-day Indonesia and New Guinea was Dutchman Abel Tasman's voyage in 1642 and 1643. The governor of Batavia had ordered Tasman to find the unknown South Land. On his 8-month voyage, Tasman sailed west from Batavia, today's Jakarta. Keeping the Indonesian islands to the north, he eventually turned and sailed far to the south before turning east. After navigating a great distance, he hit landfall. He followed the shoreline south, mapping it as he went, turned east, then north, but left the coast to head east again. He named this bushy landmass Antony van Diemen's Land, after Batavia's governor. After some days he made landfall again. Thinking he had sailed as far as Tierra del Fuego in South America, he noted Statenland in his logbook. Statenland was the Dutch for the Spanish name of Argentina's Islas de los Estados, but Tasman was well short of Statenland. He mapped the coastline as he sailed north, eventually coming into open sea. He then took the route north of New Guinea and the Indonesian islands and returned to Batavia. Abel Tasman's voyage of 1642 to 1643 set the limits to the maps of the continent south of Indonesia and New Guinea until James Cook's voyage of 1769 and 1770. Maps named the continent thus far discovered Hollandia Nova. The English called it New Holland. Cook most likely worked from the map produced by historian John Campbell in 1748, which included Tasman's discoveries. Campbell's map showed New Holland's unbroken coastline running west from New Guinea in the northeast, then south, turning east and ending northwest of Van Diemen's Land. The coastline mapped at Statenland is now termed Zeelandia Nova, after the Dutch province of Zeeland. Tasman had mapped the west coast of present-day New Zealand. The east coast of New Holland was a blank area on Campbell's map. After Cook left Tahiti, he sailed south, reaching this coast of Zeelandia Nova. After mapping both islands and going ashore at 8 different places, he sailed west and in time came to a wooded coastline. Turning north along the wooded coast, he eventually sailed into the bay he named Botany Bay. He and Joseph Banks found the countryside around Botany Bay promising for cultivation. They spoke of the natives as noble savage in bearing, while others had found them the most miserable people they had ever seen. Cook then sailed more than 2,500 miles to the north, mapping the coastline as he went. At the tip of the continent he found what is now called the Torres Strait. This was a key piece that all before him had missed or had failed to slot into the puzzle. Cook could now connect the dots. After his voyage of 1769 and 1770, maps could present New Holland as a whole continent separated from New Guinea and with an unbroken coastline. The only part that remained to be clarified was the separation of Van Diemen's Land from the New Holland continent. Cook claimed the land he had discovered for the British Crown and called it New South Wales. Before Cook's voyage there had already been much talk about Tasman's discoveries. Fiction writers entertained the public with their speculations of what lay to the south of the Dutch Indies. Alongside novelists' wild imagination, there was serious discussion about New Holland and the Pacific area's imperial prospects. Britain and France were the foremost powers of the day, and neither wanted to be left behind in investigating the strategic and commercial advantages. For Britain's government, the conflict with the Americans and the loss of the American colonies presented an extra dilemma. What were they going to do with the burgeoning prison population? Getting rid of them to the Americans was no longer an option. With the ongoing public chatter about the prospects offered by the New Holland continent, it was no surprise that Botany Bay on the coast of New South Wales was suggested as an excellent place to dump the country's miserable felons. Some found the idea laughable, some impossible, others morally fraught. But after much talk, the government decided to take up the suggestion. A plan was developed. Most people understood then and since that the desire to relieve Britain's overcrowded prisons was the overriding motivation to set up a penal settlement in New South Wales. Historian Geoffrey Blainey has claimed the issues were more extensive than the choice of a penal settlement. The motivations were fourfold, he suggested. First, Botany Bay was an outstanding place to send convicts. Second, there was a need to establish a port of call on the developing trade routes in the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Third, there was the availability of excellent quality flax and timber for naval purposes on Norfolk Island, shipbuilding and sailmaking. And finally, the climate and soil of New South Wales was suitable for agriculture. However, this last was based on the misleading impression that Cook and Banks had of Botany Bay's physical environment. The soil was not nearly as fertile as they thought, and water sources were scarce. Blainey has concluded that Cook arrived in Botany Bay when rain and high humidity prevailed. All things considered, the British plan to set up a colony in New South Wales and a presence in that sphere of the world was an almost unimaginable imperial undertaking. Few people could comprehend its extent. At the time, Britons had every reason to see the plan as a grandiose fantasy, likely to end in a spectacular failure. Ironically, the rich, depraved, God-forsaken convicts were indispensable to the undertaking's success. The task of establishing the New South Wales colony fell to Officer Arthur Phillip. The British government appointed him Captain General and Governor-in-Chief. His brief was to found a settlement at Botany Bay, cultivate the land for provisions, maintain religion and order, encourage the convicts to good habits, free them if their conduct warranted it, and grant them the means of cultivating the land. It was a brief for redemption. It was also to seek friendly relations with the natives. As for the social and political structure of the colony, a familiar template was to go from Britain with Phillip. Historian Manning Clark wrote, quote, "To assist him in the administration of affairs, there was to be a criminal court presided over by a judge advocate and 6 military officers, and a civil court consisting of the judge advocate and 2 officers appointed by the governor. It was a government designed to ensure law and order and subordination by terror, a government designed for men living in servitude rather than free men," unquote. Despite the tight control and the absence of some form of democratic election for many years, The colony would have all the elements of the British government in principle: executive, legislative and judiciary branches and the ancillaries. The coming years would gradually unloose the strings binding the elements to one overseeing authority. As will become evident, Manning Clark exaggerated the terror of the colony's authority and the servitude of the convicts. The terror diminished while the population of free settlers and the need for convict labour grew. The First Fleet departed Portsmouth on 13 May 1787. The 11 ships headed by the two naval ships, HMS Sirius and HMS Supply, carried all up 1,420 people, including 753 convicts, 548 men, 188 women and 17 children. They stopped first at Rio de Janeiro in South America. From there they sailed to Cape Town for more provisioning. From Cape Town they sailed via the Great South Ocean to Botany Bay. When Arthur Phillip, on board the Supply as the leading vessel, sailed into Botany Bay on 18 January 1788, natives in canoe near the south shore hastened to land while the women and children took to the bush. According to Manning Clark, the natives, now on the water's edge, set up a horrid howl and indicated by angry gestures with sticks and stones that the white man was not wanted. Clark, for reasons of his own, is surely overstating the reaction. I hardly think the natives were already full of views about the white man as they watched the Supply sail by and anchor. The ready explanation for any howling and gesturing is that they were reacting in fear to the perceived encroachment on their territory. Aboriginal tribes fought amongst themselves over territory, so it was routine to act aggressively towards any strangers, white or black. It is stretching it to claim the natives discerned Cook and his crew were white and thus hostile because of their colour. Moreover, different first-hand accounts of this event are on record. In his narrative of the expedition to Botany Bay, Watkin Tench, captain of Marines, wrote that the natives on the day of arrival were, quote, assembled on the beach of the south shore of Botany Bay to the number of not less than 40 persons, shouting and making many uncouth signs and gestures. This appears to be the incident to which Clark is referring, but Tench follows this account with descriptions of several subsequent meetings during which the natives were friendly or showed no sign of aggression or resentment. David Collins, captain of Marines, appointed Judge Advocate and Secretary to Governor Phillip on arrival, wrote his version of what was possibly the same event, but on a different day. It happened the following way. Governor Phillip did not find the conditions at Botany Bay as Cook had described them. Watkin Tench, reflecting Phillip's concerns, wrote that the country around Botany Bay rather disappointed our host, being invariably sandy and unpromising for the purposes of cultivation, though the trees and grass flourish in great luxuriancy. There was also nowhere to set up encampment for more than 1,000 people. More importantly, they could not find a sufficient supply of water. On 21 January, Governor Phillip decided to take a party of 3 rigged rowboats to Port Jackson to see if there was a more suitable place for the settlement. Captain Collins was of the party, but he wrote this account in the third person. The day was mild and serene, and there being but a gentle swell without the mouth of the harbour, the excursion promised to be a pleasant one. Their little fleet attracted the attention of several parties of the natives as they proceeded along the coast, who greeted them in the same words and in the same tone of vociferation, shouting everywhere, "Warra, warra, warra," words which, by the gestures that accompanied them, could not be interpreted into invitations to land or expressions of welcome. It must, however, be observed that at Botany Bay the natives had hitherto conducted themselves sociably and peaceably towards the parties of our officers and people with whom they had hitherto met, and by no means seemed to regard them as enemies or invaders of their country and tranquillity. Governor Phillip had little expectation of coming across a spot more suitable for settlement in Port Jackson. In this he was pleasantly disappointed. Captain David Collins continues his account. In one of the coves of this noble and capacious harbour, equal if not superior to yet anyone known in the world, it was determined to fix the settlement, and on the 23rd, having examined it as fully as time would allow, the governor and his party left Port Jackson and its friendly and peaceful inhabitants, for such he found them everywhere, and returned to Botany Bay. From the eyewitness accounts of the first contacts, Governor Phillip and his executive team made every effort to create friendly relations with the Aboriginals. Indeed, in the first period, the contact was friendly. However, it was never going to remain so. The cultural gap was unbridgeable. History is full of examples of conflict caused by the expansion and immigration of peoples. The clashes would come later, but they were not over Governor Phillip's and his people's colour. It was inevitable and necessary that one side would be the all-prevailing victor. That ends the first part of this presentation. The second part will take up the First Fleet's efforts to establish a settlement.